Okay, hello everyone and welcome. My name is Rachel Wesson. I am the Events and Communications Specialist at the UC Berkeley Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity. In partnership with our friends at Fortinet and the UC Berkeley School of Information, we are so glad to have you join us for today's discussion, Cyber Incidents, Insights from Global Leaders in Breach Response, featuring this expert panel of practitioners who are at the forefront of thinking about cyber breach and incident response. So we've got a lot of really great terrain to cover with our 4 panelists. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator for today's discussion, Will Cooper. We have a few UC Berkeley alum or students on today's panel, and Will is one of those alumni. He graduated from Berkeley Law in 2011. And after practicing for several large law firms, he is now currently a vice president of litigation and compliance at Fortinet, an S&P 500 cybersecurity company. So Will, thanks so much for joining us today, and I will pass it over to you to introduce today's panel.
Great, thank you so much, Rachel. Very happy to be here. We have a tremendous panel today of industry experts and a ton to learn, so I'm really excited. I'll give quick bios for each and then we can dive into questions. First up is Scott Linlaw. Scott is a managing director in Sard Verbinnen Company's Washington, D.C. office, where he's co-head of the firm's cybersecurity and data privacy practice. He advises companies on responding to and preparing for data breaches and cyber incidents, specifically how to communicate strategically on these incidents to protect reputation and value. Scott earned his JD as well as master's degree in journalism at UC Berkeley, and full disclosure, we were law school classmates at Berkeley Law a few years ago. Roselene Gomes is the director of cybersecurity and intelligence solutions for Mastercard, where she identifies and delivers fraud, safety, and security solutions to protect the integrity of the payment system, as well as ensure the digital ecosystem and payments are convenient, seamless, and secure across all stakeholders, financial institutions, retailers, processors, and consumers for Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific Islands. Rose is currently completing her Master of Information and Cybersecurity at UC Berkeley's School of Information. Welcome, Rose. And our last panelist is Marcy Rosen. She's currently a senior legal director in the Washington, D.C. office of Zwiljan PLLC, specializing in cybersecurity and privacy. Her practice includes both preparedness and counseling for incident response, working with a diverse range of clients and managing and recovering from many different types of cybersecurity incidents, such as malware intrusion, state-sponsored hacking, extortion, and inadvertent information disclosures. So as you can see, we have a tremendous diversity of expertise and experience with our panel. And that's very fitting because in any breach response situation, you're always going to have a lot of collaboration and coordination among various functional groups. So here we've got the legal side with Marcy, the product and engineering side with Rose, and the communications side with Scott. So learning about how that communication and coordination works is very important. And sometimes the decisive factor in an organization's success in responding to a breach is how that communication and collaboration across the functional group plays out. So we have a lot of really good learning today. I'll start with the first question, which is how you got into cybersecurity and what your day-to-day looks like. And why don't we start with Rose?
Thanks, Will. So I got started with cybersecurity when I joined Mastercard about 4 years ago. So at the time, the company was going through and making a number of acquisitions that kind of played in machine learning, AI, the biometric space. And even though I have a degree in computer science, there was still that I didn't know, a lot that I didn't know, and a lot that I wanted to learn. So when the opportunity came up to join the cyber and intelligence team, I took full advantage, to be completely honest. And as part of the CNI team, I'm responsible for managing Mastercard's fraud, cybersecurity, risk solutions for our B2B customers, and that includes financial institutions, payment service providers, government, and different entities across the ecosystem. And that's across, as you mentioned, Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific Islands. As I was progressing in the role, there was still so much more that I wanted to learn, and that kind of interested me in getting my master's degree through UC Berkeley, which is where here I am. And when it comes to incident response, historically, cybersecurity has always been a defensive game. The when, where, and how it's often determined by the attacker. But today, we have to kind of go a step further and protect the customer data. And that requires a proactive stance to be taken by the organizations. And that's where my role kind of comes in as part of the CNI team. I'm managing those conversations with our B2B customers to help them make sure that cybersecurity and fraud is top of mind. The threat landscape is continuously evolving, and bad actors are leveraging automation, botnets, mimicking human behaviors to gain access to different platforms and environments. So I'm focused on identifying and understanding what the organization's pain points are as it relates to fraud and cybersecurity, but also helping them to deliver solutions that can mitigate or reduce and proactively monitor those cyber threats. Whether it's monitoring their own cyber posture or managing their third-party risks, but then also making sure that the conversations are focused on what the organizations can do to ensure that, when data is compromised, that data is not coming back into their ecosystem by the bad actors, who have stolen or brought the credentials on the dark web, whether it's by blocking or declining transactions or fraudulent applications or logins.
That's great. Thank you, Rose. Marcy, how did you get into cybersecurity, and what's your day-to-day look like?
Sure. So I got into cybersecurity when I started my career at a big firm. That was about a decade ago, and there just started to be a little more activity around new laws in cybersecurity development of best practices. And just a little while after that, in 2013, 2014, we saw that really big rise in retail breaches, the Target breach, Home Depot, and there just was a ton of work coming out of that. So I really got a chance to dig into it, and it was really fun to be in an area of law without that much law there. All of the few laws that there are around cybersecurity are all relatively new and constantly changing. And I found that it was just a really fun area to be learning new laws alongside really senior partners at my firm. In my role today, I help my clients with both incident preparedness, doing incident response plans, information security policies, and designing and facilitating tabletop exercises, and also helping companies on the reactive side. So when there is an incident, we view our role as kind of a breach coach, in the sense that we're with clients from the time something first looks like it might be awry, through engaging forensic help, guiding them on communications, both internal and external, and analyzing legal notification obligations and kind of minimizing legal risk through that process.
That's great. Okay, and Scott, how about you? How'd you get into cybersecurity, and what's your day-to-day?
Thanks, Will. Hey, it's great to be back at Berkeley, if just virtually. I couldn't agree more with what you said about data breaches being cross-disciplinary events. These are not just IT events. They're not just legal events. They're certainly both of those, but these are also potential reputational events, and communications is not going to, completely eradicate the reputational concern or fix the cyber situation, but it can help mitigate some of those reputational things that a company can make A lot of companies think of this as just, a legal event or a technical event. But the real issue from our lane is that goodwill and trust that a company's worked, years or decades to build up can just evaporate in a second. That's where we come in, and my background in cyber law and before that reporting are what brought me here. After law school, I went into cybersecurity law along with intellectual property law. Before that, being a reporter for many years, it all kind of converges together in this job. Every day I work with lawyers like Marcy, often in the trenches, and IT teams to kind of get my arms around data incidents. And once we do, and once we set a communication strategy, it's our job to communicate with reporters. So my experiences in both journalism and law set me up nicely to be kind of a bridge between those two worlds. In an incident, hopefully we're brought in early. It's always best to not be brought in, weeks after the incident's been discovered, but before it's been disclosed. Our job from the earliest hours is to understand the facts as they're available. Often, you're kind of groping around in the fog of a data breach, and it's very hard to understand the facts on the ground. But understand the facts as best we can. Understand the legal obligations, working closely with a team like Marcy's, because legal obligations, the disclosure, notification rules that we'll probably talk about later, are communications milestones and markers. Taking all that into account, we help, a company, or in some cases a hospital, a university, set a communication strategy, set tactics, and then as the facts become clearer, as the incident develops, adapt those tactics along the way.
That's great. And it's helpful to hear what you're thinking about right when you get started. And I think that's a nice segue for Marcy. When a breach comes and you get that phone call, what's the first thing, Marcy, that you're thinking about and that you're counseling your clients from the very beginning from a legal perspective? Oh, you're on mute.
So the very first thing I'm thinking about when an incident comes in is how risky the incident is from a legal perspective. And has the client done anything to either mitigate that risk or heighten that risk? And kind of the riskiest incidents are the ones involving personal data, especially sensitive personal data, social security numbers, credit card numbers. And when those have been exposed through like a hacking kind of an incident versus, a misdirected email to a vendor, that kind of thing. Those incidents are where we need to get forensic help involved right away, where we need to partner with a communications group like Scott's, and where we need to be really careful about mitigating risk. As part of that, what I'm thinking about throughout this process is whether we've taken the steps we need to put the incident and all of its communications and vendors under privilege. So to do that, legal and ideally outside counsel engages those vendors on behalf of the client, which can offer protection to those communications, especially in the early phase of an incident investigation where you don't know for sure what's going on. There's a lot of speculation about what could have happened. Your team might, exaggerate or kind of be in crisis mode and say certain things that aren't wholly accurate or paint a misleading picture about what happened. So having the cover of privilege over all that can really help set up a client to minimize risk later on in the event of litigation or an investigation.
Great, thanks. And Rose, coming from your perspective, do you have any thoughts about what to do for first steps when an incident occurs?
Yeah, no, I think, the natural reaction of a breach is to focus on the immediate impact. So, which is important. The issue needs to be assessed, it needs to be remediated. And given my role in the product management space, the real challenge that I see is the long-term impact to the business or to the organization. A lot of that comes from how the organization responds to the breach. Having an incident response plan is key. And anticipating all the different scenarios and the impacts that we'll have across the business units. But when we look at the long tail of cyber breach, apart from the financial repercussions, the fines, the legal fees, PRs, I think Scott was touching on this a little bit earlier, a little while ago. Reputational damage can have a significant impact to the organization. Coming from a marketing background, this can lead to higher customer turnover. And if there is extended media attention, this is going to have an ongoing impact to the organization. And another thing that I often think that is overlooked is the cost that's associated with, when you're trying to do acquisitions, retaining customers, and ongoing remediation. For those lost customers, it's a cost to the organization to get them back, and ultimately impacts the bottom line, right? So those are the key things that I think is important to take into consideration. But also, I think as cybersecurity professionals, we need to start to simplify our messages for our stakeholders. I think that's really key, especially when we're having conversations with senior leaders, execs, and business partners. We need to get their support to make the investments in the tools and solutions that we as cybersecurity professionals need. And oftentimes it's very difficult to have those conversations when it's so complicated and we're using so many jargons that they may not understand. So it's hard for them to appreciate, where we're coming from. So we need to demonstrate that cybersecurity tools are not just an overhead. It's not just a cost, but it can help, it can help deliver value. It can help protect their revenue and then ultimately protect their brand reputation. Reputational risk should always be considered, when we're developing cybersecurity strategies. Of the millions of dollars that we're investing in ways to respond to cyber breaches, reputation risks and customer trust are two things that are really hard to rebuild, and it takes a long time for it to come back if the damage has been done.
Absolutely. I see everybody nodding their head. I think that's so true. So those are some really good thoughts on best practices. Let's go to the other side of the continuum. And if you could change one thing that you see organizations do, big mistakes that they're making when an incident comes in, what would that be? And Marcy, why don't we start with you?
Sure. So I think the biggest mistake goes back to my previous point about privilege and not protecting the communications that happen, especially in the early phases of an incident. I dealt with an incident not too long ago where it was a ransomware incident. And on the good side of things, they had a really well-developed security and IT team that really jumped into action and started taking steps to address the incident. But unfortunately, they didn't really consult legal from the outset, and they engaged a forensic provider independently. So it didn't have that cover of privilege with legal. And, we had to take various steps to, get a privileged investigator working alongside them, and it really complicated things. And I think that speaks to a larger issue of companies can have a lot of policies and procedures in place, but like Scott noted earlier, they have to be cross-disciplinary. I've seen companies with pages and pages of standard operating procedures for each individual team. And then I go to do a tabletop exercise with them and I say, okay, IT, you discover this issue. What do you do next? And they do a great job of triaging and seeing it through as far as they can. And then they stop because they don't have a really clear direction of how to do a handoff to another team and how to keep the lines of communication going throughout the incident. So having those cross-disciplinary processes in place and having a really holistic team to address an incident is really important.
Makes good sense. As in-house counsel, I constantly across many different areas say, come to legal first. It's always important to do that for privilege and other reasons. So Scott, what about you? What one thing do you think companies could do better, or what big example of mistakes are you seeing out there?
Yeah, I'd say the biggest mistake that companies make is curling up and just hoping the incident's going to blow over and that no one will notice, or similarly kind of going Sphinx and not saying anything to show transparency, to show contrition, maybe to show that you're not being callous. One example that comes to mind is a well-known consumer-facing technology company that had a ransomware incident. And the world knew about it because their own employees were tweeting about it. But the company just was completely silent about it for days. And the company looked, unresponsive and kind of cold, while there were millions of users around the world, including pilots, were, in a very bad position because this technology was down. So, be thoughtful, be strategic, act with integrity, and communicate to the world that you have acted with integrity.
Makes good sense. And one question I have for you, Scott, in particular with your media, both background as a journalist and now as a communication expert, how would you, I think everybody here and probably most of the people in the audience are big consumers of news when it comes to cybersecurity. From your perspective, how well is the reality of what's really going on in the world, in the boardrooms that you're in every day and working with your clients and what you see? How would you compare that to the coverage in the media, and any advice on how to find really good coverage?
Yeah, at a high level, the media landscape is, the news cycle is loud, the news cycle is short. One sort of paradoxical advantage that companies have these days is breach fatigue. There are so many incidents. Consumers are just bombarded with letters, it seems like every month. Dear consumer, your personal information has been compromised, go get credit monitoring, we'll pay for it. That there's a certain kind of numbness out there. But companies that show bad judgment, that over communicate, that under communicate, can find themselves in the news in very unwelcome ways. I'll make one other observation. That is, there's sort of a trickle up. There are cyber trade publications that they just troll these public government websites, state AGs, HHS, et cetera. And it's like a smorgasbord for reporters. There's no escaping it. And so these trade publications that just cover, I get a publication called Data Breach Today, believe it or not. They just sit there and monitor, and they write stories about data breaches that usually trickle up to more significant mainstream news media. So the bottom line is there's really no escaping if you've got an incident.
Great. And circling back, Rose, to you on the question of things organizations can do better or mistakes to avoid. Any highlights from your perspective?
I think, one of the areas that I've been focusing on lately is small businesses. I think small businesses in general, they have some challenges in the cybersecurity domain. And that a lot of that has to do with, lack of resources, lack of funds, lack of SMEs that's available. Oftentimes what we see is that, individuals, if they do have an SME, or rather if they have a resource that's focusing on cybersecurity, they're not just focusing on cybersecurity. They're wearing multiple hats. They're doing multiple things. So cybersecurity is not really top of mind for them. A recent survey that was done a couple of years ago, it shows that more than half of small businesses believe that they're unlikely to be targeted by cyber criminals. Half of the respondents don't even provide any cybersecurity training. So there's really a big gap when it comes to small businesses and having the proper cybersecurity tools or resources to help them. And when we look at data and when we look at the research, we also see that the types of attacks that are happening for SMBs are similar to what large corporations are dealing with as well. But it takes longer for SMBs to kind of uncover those incidents because they don't have the resources. So I think that's an area that we all need to focus on, because what we're hearing in the last couple of years is that, third-party risks, supply chain breaches that are happening. So it's a responsibility for, the larger organizations to help, manage those third-party risks with their vendors and the small businesses.
Thanks, Rose. You mentioned supply chain, and Marcy, circling back to you, you mentioned one of the more sensitive areas in breaches that you experience is with personal information. Another area, and there's overlap here, but another area that conceptually is a little different is that supply chain world. We all saw it with SolarWinds, a very prominent example. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're seeing in general in that universe? How ubiquitous is it? How frequently are you seeing these supply chain attacks, and then also how they're very dramatic, and you read things in the media about some company has a supply chain attack and they have 100,000 customers and each one of their customers has thousands of customers. But how actually consequential in the real world are these attacks?
Yeah, I would say they're extremely consequential. I think hackers have noticed that supply chain attacks offer the opportunity for a really large attack surface versus targeting just one particular company. You saw this in the Kaseya breach as well. And I think we'll just see more. I'd even characterize like exploits we've seen with Log4j as sort of in the same realm of supply chain attacks that just keep getting hit over and exploited over and over again. So it's definitely an attractive target. It's really tough for businesses because they rely on these vendors, these suppliers to support their infrastructure. And they're a little bit powerless until those, they can try to cut that out of their network, but oftentimes they're really tightly integrated. So they're a little powerless until that vendor can get that patched and restore their supply chain. So I think this just underscores the importance of doing your diligence on all of your suppliers, your infrastructure, and subcontractors of those vendors and infrastructure providers to ensure that you really have a tight network with robust security controls.
Yeah, one thing that's interesting about the supply chain world is that the government is a customer of so many companies, and so many companies have unbelievably large supply chains and huge footprint on the internet, and then they're supplying products and services to the government, which is what we saw in SolarWinds, which really creates huge implications for what people are doing in their day jobs just at a private company. And that's a nice segue to the regulatory landscape and how that's evolving and changing. And we'll start with you, Marcy, but I want to hear from Rose and Scott too. Where do you think that's headed? What does it look like a year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now? What's your sense of the movement there?
Yeah, so I used to be really optimistic about getting a federal breach notification law. It seemed like every year somebody would introduce something. It's really a bipartisan issue. I don't know anybody in Congress who is against the idea of a federal standard for breach notification. It's just, number one, it often gets deprioritized with a number of competing obligations, and we haven't had one yet, so why do we need one now? And number two, things like preemption, what data is covered under those kinds of laws, all of those, there's constant fights about them, and Congress has thus far been unable to come to a resolution. So I'm holding out some hope that we will eventually get to a federal breach notification law. It would make things much simpler and more affordable, frankly, for companies that experience breaches and give consumers more uniform rights across states. But in this day and age, in the next year or so, with recovery from COVID and the Russia-Ukraine issue, which we may touch on here, I'm not super hopeful in the next couple of years we'll see that. Looking ahead, though, I do hope that we get to cybersecurity regulation that goes beyond just a breach notification law. Having standards, especially in the critical infrastructure sectors, can be hugely important, not just to ensure security itself, but to give companies some certainty about what they're working towards. There's a lot of laws right now, state laws in particular, that require reasonable security. And I could do, 3 webinars just talking about what that might mean in different contexts, and having some more concrete guidance as to what that means and what businesses are striving for would be helpful.
Yeah, I always find it fascinating how in Wall Street, got these big banks, they have an entire floor of their headquarters filled with regulators and a century plus of regulation of how banks handle consumers' money. But then when it comes to how companies handle consumers' data, it's just completely the other side of the continuum in terms of the regulatory landscape. Scott, I know this is central to what you do, and you mentioned that it's a part of the communication platform for your clients. So what are your thoughts on the regulatory landscape and where it may be heading?
Yeah, I agree with everything Marcy said. Although the reality on the ground right now for companies is that they face an ever tightening web of laws from the state up to the federal and even to international regimes that are forcing communications very much affect our lane. You've got breach notification laws in all 50 states. I think it's 19 or 20 state attorneys general. Once they receive a report of a breach from a company, they instantly turn around and post it on the AG's website. So we tell clients that that's your press release, like it or not. The AG, if you have a breach in Maine, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Marcy knows these laws by heart. You're basically, the AG is going to put it out for you. So what are we going to do? Are we going to put it out before the AG on our own terms, or are we going to let the AG announce it for us? On top of that, you get ever tightening SEC guidance requiring companies to disclose. You've got, as I said earlier, HHS has a whole website disclosing where personal information has been stolen or breached from companies. So there's nowhere to hide. On the other side of the equation, you have ransomware criminals with the PR channels. They've got bullhorns of their own, and they've got the incentive to publicize their work because it will help them leverage ransom extortion payments. So I think it's only going to get tighter from here. I think the bill that Congress passed the other day and is now on President Biden's desk would require infrastructure owners, certain operators to report to the federal government if they have a substantial cyber attack and report within 72 hours. If they've got a ransomware payment going out, they've got to report within 24 hours. I think there's some rulemaking yet to be done around that. Also, last week, the SEC proposed changing rules to require greater disclosure of cyber risks and actual cyber incidents. So the vice is tightening, and it's a big deal for communications.
And Scott and Will, sorry, one really quick follow-up to that. We just focused a lot on US law in our responses, but I think it's critical to note that there are other international regimes like the GDPR that requires 72-hour breach notification to regulators. And in this day and age, more and more of our clients are multinational, and trying to fit together that notification picture with all of these competing and different timelines is definitely a challenge.
Absolutely. And before we turn to Rose, just want to remind the audience, we'd love questions. Feel free to plug them into the chat, and I'll go through them. And that would be great if anyone has any questions for the panel. Rose, any thoughts on the regulatory landscape?
Yeah, I think I'm on the same page as Marcy. I don't think it's going to be something that happens, today or tomorrow. Maybe in a couple of years, hopefully we'll start to see some laws that come into place that helps. But I think the other challenge that we need to be mindful of is, when a company has a cyber incident, they often don't know about it. If we look at the SolarWinds example, they didn't know 9 months or so. So even though you're required to notify within 72 hours, you don't know the information for 9 months. So the damage is kind of already started to happen. Even when we look at, data breaches for other organizations, they also don't know for three to 6 months. And consumers feel it right away, right? When a bad actor has your information, they wait maybe a week to use those credentials. And, you start seeing bills, you start seeing applications in your name. So, it's great that, 72 hours notification is happening, but I think consumers at the end of the day are starting to face it right away. So, I think it goes back again to the organizations to be more proactive, to make sure that cybersecurity is top of mind, and they're doing what they need to have due diligence in place to prevent or mitigate as much of those risks as possible.
It's a great point. And I'm always fascinated by what you know about cyber incident and what you don't know, and kind of by definition, what you don't know the contours of that. So it's entirely possible at least from my perspective, that there can be breaches that are never, if it takes 9 months to find out about SolarWinds, it could take 9 years to find out about something. How would you rule that out? So it's really fascinating. Just the scope of the challenge is really broad and really hard to measure. Got a great question from the audience. Thanks, Anne. And I think this is a good question for Scott. How do you evaluate the effectiveness of communication around a breach after all is said and done?
Well, one way to answer that might be, what companies do right in our view, or what companies do wrong. I think to look at the end state, if there's no litigation, unlikely. If there's no regulatory action, that's a win. If reputation's been relatively untarnished, that's a win. But behind all that is having the judgment, the experience not to over communicate, not to under communicate or over communicate, to think about that issue of proactivity very, very carefully, particularly in a ransomware incident where, as I said earlier, you've got government guns pointing at you from one side, you've got ransomware guns pointing at you from the other. At the core of every ransomware incident is the communications question. Should we just get this out on our own terms? I think sometimes the hallmark of a well-communicated incident is, was there an apology? Now that's not called for in every instance. Marcy always has a view that we want to take into consideration about the risks of apologizing, but a note of contrition can be helpful in a mega incident like T-Mobile, like Capital One, with millions, or in the case of Capital One, 100 million plus individuals affected. The CEO, I think, rightly stepped out and apologized. So those are a few kind of markers of an effective response.
Great. And Scott touched on litigation and the absence of that being a success. It's another area of the law, in addition to regulation, that's not very well developed, and there's not a lot going on there compared to other areas that have been around a lot longer. Marcy, do you have a sense of where the litigation landscape is and where that may be going? And do you think that could rise to be somewhat of an effective deterrent in the absence of the federal legislation that may not come?
Yeah, I think it's already quite an effective deterrent. You see a lot of variation between jurisdictions and circuits and the like on what kind of causes of action in following a data breach will be recognized, what can proceed to trial and all that. But I think just the threat of having a class action in connection with the data breach, whether or not it can ultimately succeed, is a major driver in cybersecurity decisions and investment that a company takes into account. So I hope that, there's always going to be litigation no matter what. Plaintiffs' lawyers are very creative in coming up with a cause of action in connection with a breach, but it's quite a blunt tool. It's really more of a dark cloud hanging over businesses' heads versus a guidepost about what actually to do. So I hope that's not the driver of cybersecurity actions going forward.
Good way to put it. Okay, great. We've got a couple more questions. This one from Jose. Question for the whole panel. Is there a fix for the future of cybersecurity? How can we change the culture and shift the mindsets of the new generation about cybersecurity? And Rose, why don't you start?
Sure. Thanks, Will. I think we need to start by educating our younger generation. For students in elementary school, junior high, or high school, I think cybersecurity is one of those core educational courses that needs to be embedded within the education system. Students as young as 9 years old, they have a phone, they have a smartphone. 14-year-olds, they have social media accounts, they're going onto TikTok, they're going onto Instagram. So it's important to educate them to make sure that they know about the proper hygiene when it comes to their digital footprint. They need to know about proper password protocols. They need to know about what data to share online, what they should share and what they shouldn't share. So I think the first big step that we need to do is make sure that education is available to the younger generation.
Great point. Fortinet just put out a book last year, a children's book all about privacy and cybersecurity, and I think it's a great way to focus on that. Scott, what are your thoughts?
Well, first of all, I agree with everything Rose said. I'll take it to the entire other end of the continuum, and I'll focus on boards. I think boards have to stop closing their eyes and looking away and hoping that someone with technical experience, the chief security officer, or someone's just going to take care of this. I think boards have to engage and understand, and I won't geek out too much on boards, but I think some of the best run companies on cyber have dedicated cyber experts on the board itself. Some companies delegate this to a risk committee and they're sort of ambiguous in their focus. Some are laser focused. Some boards are laser focused on cyber and are driving management, driving planning. I mean, we have one company that's got a calendar with almost every day in 2022, some by direction of the board, some cyber activity. So boards have to make really clear to management that they expect the company to be prepared to respond technically, legally, and communications wise. And of course, boards have to make sure that management has the budget to achieve these things.
Marcy, do you want me to repeat the question or do you have it?
I think I got it. And let me
Okay,
just
great.
say, Rose, I totally agree with you, not only as a lawyer, but as a parent. I absolutely agree. We should be doing more to educate our kids about cybersecurity. Bouncing off of Scott's point about how boards could be driving cybersecurity culture better, I'll throw in a plug to say that I think the insurance industry is just starting to be a driver on changing cybersecurity culture as well. I think a lot of companies until the past couple of years were making decisions about investment in cybersecurity based on the potential or lack of potential for insurance coverage if they did have an incident. And in a lot of cases, it was cheaper to simply buy a lot of insurance coverage and not make the proactive investment in cybersecurity. Just in the past year, I have seen requirements for renewals of cyber policy, just pages and pages of more requirements around, having firewalls, having intrusion detection systems, having good backups to protect against the impact of ransomware. I think having these requirements as a prerequisite for coverage is really going to drive companies into a more proactive mindset.
Great. And we have another question, this one from Lisa. Scott, for you, what does over communication look like? Is it better for consumers to get as much communication as possible?
See Target, as Marcy referenced earlier. Target, I think it was 2013, is still the paradigm example of a company that over communicated. They kept putting out statements that they kept having to then correct. It's just communications 101. I think most companies get this now. Before you say something publicly, make sure it's a confirmed fact. So that's what over communicating looks like.
Great. Any more questions from the audience are welcome. We've got a few more minutes before we turn to the final question. And one thing that we've heard a little bit about, but haven't really drilled down on is ransomware. Marcy, I'll start with you. Can you give us a sense of what that world is like these days? And in the media, at least from my perspective, it seems to be really, really prominent. And a lot of lay people, I feel like almost think of a ransomware as a cyber incident and not recognize that there are lots of different examples, including hackers parking in your servers and causing mischief without ever asking to get paid or threatening. But what's the ransomware world like these days from a legal perspective?
Yeah, so I'd say, as I'm sure many of you know, sort of last spring was the peak of ransomware attacks, or at least had been for the 10 years that I've been in practice. And we saw just an enormous volume of attacks and an enormous amount of payoffs. Not everybody pays. I'd venture to say not even the majority of companies pay. But you saw those attacks happen again and again because of the high rate of return. And a lot of companies couldn't recover as well and had to do the payoff because they weren't making those investments in backups, in good incident response plans, to have a plan for how do we recover, or how do we, proceed forward, even if we do have these systems offline. I would say just in the past 6 months, we've seen increased scrutiny on insurance payments and coverage for ransomware payments, which has really pressured companies to not pay because of those kinds of coverage questions. And now I think that the big driver that is too recent for me to have had firsthand experience with, but I can only imagine that the new sanctions on Russia is really, really complicating the landscape for ransomware payments. OFAC, the Office of Foreign Asset Control, which regulates these kinds of sanctions, already came out a while back with guidance saying, hey, there's strict liability if you do a ransom payoff and it happens to go to a sanctioned group, which included Russian ransomware drivers. And now, given the extent of sanctions on Russia and the lack of knowledge about who's really behind a lot of these attacks, I think it would be really, really hard now to effectively pay off a ransom and stay within the bounds of the law.
Interesting point. Scott, what about you? I know you've been involved in a lot of ransomware. What are your thoughts on current state of play?
So I'd say about 3/4 of our work in the last year and a half has been ransomware incidents. Just to step back, on a nomenclature issue, ransomware, the terms, thrown around for a couple different types of, subspecies of attacks. One really is ransomware, strictly speaking, and that's where bad guys break in, plant malware, and can ultimately cripple a company's or a hospital's or a water board's systems. That's one. The other is they break in, they steal data, and then they post it or they offer it for sale and demand an extortion payment. I say the term's a little bit loose because the latter, without the implanting malware, if you simply smash and grab and try and sell data, it's not technically ransomware. There's been no malware implanted, but all of them kind of fall under the common umbrella of ransomware these days in terms of extortion. These things both, especially the latter class, breaking in, stealing data and offering it for sale, raise a lot of tough communications issues. As I said earlier, around the clock's ticking. A lot of times these guys will go public. The bad guys will go public if they don't get their extortion payment. And so does the victimized entity, company, I'll just say company here, does the victimized company go public and announce this ransomware attack on its own terms, on its own timeline? Or does it wait for the bad guys to do it? Sometimes they put press releases out, these criminal gangs. Sometimes they just quietly put an offer to sell data on the dark web. Either way, a company, from day one of a ransomware attack better reckon with the question of, we want to put this out on our own terms or let them do it for us.
Got it. We just got 3 questions from the audience, which is great and gives us an opportunity to do a little lightning round before we do closing. So first one from, I believe, Layla, going off Rose's point on SMB, could you offer some recommendations for bolstering up the cybersecurity posture of small businesses? Is there room for policy interventions or strategic partnerships with bigger companies? And Rose, I'll let you tackle that one.
It's not all dark and gloomy. I mean, when I was doing my research, what we are starting to see is that SMBs are now more likely to invest and dedicate more resources, whether it's money, people, or for data security. So SMBs are kind of starting to proactively spend more resources in that area. Coming from Mastercard, I know we have a global alliance program where we are offering security solutions for SMBs that they can start to utilize. I'm sure there are other organizations out there that have these sort of programs where they're putting the cybersecurity at the forefront for SMBs who may not have the resources. And then, there are other third parties that are out there that can help SMBs, utilize their solutions if they don't have the bandwidth within their organization to look after their security posture.
Okay, great. All right, next one from Ian. What do you think of zero trust policy? Are these policy benefits for most organizations and companies in the long run? Marcy, do you want to take a crack at that one?
Sure. I'll just start by noting that zero trust is one of those terms. I'll throw it in a bucket with like data governance. That means something different to everyone. So I'll just say, to sidestep definitional issues, the idea of doing kind of role-based access and starting with less access, less allowed connections from external ports. All of that is great, and adding on as you need is really great. You just have to balance that with actual operation of a business.
Okay, great, thanks. And last one from James. I think there's a good one for Scott. I know you mentioned some of your clients may fit in this realm. Should some crucial entities such as water supply and sewerage waste look at standalone systems separated from the internet? A cyber attack disabling such services can potentially cripple a large population very rapidly. Any thoughts on that, Scott?
Well, never having operated one of those big systems myself, it does seem probably infeasible in the 21st century to just unplug these big systems, whether it's a dam or a pipeline, from the internet and computers generally. I in my mind, I don't think of those, people out there just turning knobs, physical knobs to turn them on and off. So I'm not sure that that's possible in this day and age.
Yeah, it's really interesting and in some ways concerning just how connected everything is, and the reach that you can get from, as a hacker, the implications of just targeting one entity and how far that can go is really, really staggering.
I mean, Colonial Pipeline, which it was just a landmark event in the national consciousness on ransomware last year, was an attack on a computer system that ran fuel pipelines. So I just think they're kind of inextricable at this point.
Yeah. All right, last question, and this is one that the Berkeley Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity always likes to ask its panelists, and makes good sense that they would. What role can academic research help play on these issues? And the related question, what do you think cybersecurity curriculum should prioritize in teaching students about incident response? And Rose, since you're a student now, you can probably provide a good answer to this question.
I think there needs to be a mixture of both technical and non-technical elements that needs to be included in the curriculum. Even though, coming from a computer science background, there's still elements that I don't know that that I can learn from the technical hands-on testing when it comes to cybersecurity. But then also being able to have those business skills and use that, whether it's a boardroom conversation or whether it's a conversation with your technology stakeholders, you need to have those conversations and be the conduit between the business stakeholders and the technology specialists to drive those conversations forward. So I think there's a mixture of both technical and non-technical elements that's required in the curriculum.
Great, and we just have a minute or two left, but Rachel, any thoughts on this question? Did you hear me, Rachel?
I'll jump in on that one, Will.
Sure.
I'd love to see a piece of research, and law students out there, listen up, maybe this is your law review article. The marketplace is so skittish right now with the tightening SEC guidance. We're seeing incredibly Form 8Ks, which most of you probably know is an SEC filing disclosing a material event by a company. SEC said, you better disclose cyber events. They said this a couple of years ago. We're seeing more and more companies fire these 8Ks out about incidents, some of which are immaterial. They had no financial and they had no operational impact on the company whatsoever. Still, everyone's so nervous that they just put out an 8K. Because the SEC last year started fining companies millions of dollars. I think it would be interesting, and we've got reams and reams of 8Ks now, to see what is prompting companies to file 8Ks, 10Ks, and what's in them, because it just seems like a very chaotic disclosure environment right now as to the SEC. These are really rich reports, by the way. To come back to something Rose said earlier on the cost to companies, I saw an 8K last week that said to the dollar what a cyber incident had cost reputationally, operationally. They put dollar figures on all of them. So there's a rich trove to mine in those 8Ks.
Thanks, Scott. And my apologies, I said Rachel, our host, and I meant to pose that question to Marcy.
Oh.
My apologies. Marcy, any thoughts on the question?
Sure. I would love to see more research on what actually works when it comes to cybersecurity training. So many incidents that I handle day to day are actually initiated by human error, whether it's somebody falling for a phishing scam or a wire fraud, business email compromise situation. And we try a lot of things with training, and I don't see a lot of literature out there about what actually works. So some more research into that would be really appreciated.
Excellent. Well, thank you all very much. What a great panel. Learned a ton, and just being able to bridge the gap with the Berkeley Center and all the great work they do, and all of the people in the trenches, as all three of you very much are, I think is a really good use of time, and I think we all benefit a lot from it. So thank you.
Thanks, Will. Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much. I will take it away, and thank you, Will, for a fantastic moderation of this panel. Thank you to each of our panelists for sharing your unique lenses on these important issues. That was a lot of fun. I also want to quickly acknowledge our various CLTC supporters, our network of community partners and foundations, as well as our industry partners, organizations such as Fortinet, whose support really helps us make events like this possible. And of course, want to thank everyone in the audience for your attention today and for asking some very thoughtful questions. And we would love for you to stay in touch. So here are a few ways you can keep in touch with us at CLTC, as well as each of our panelists, who have kindly agreed to hand over their email addresses if you would like to follow up with a question directly. And we've got our CLTC info at the bottom of the screen. Please do follow us on Twitter or head to our website where you can sign up for our newsletter so that you won't miss future events and important announcements from the Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity. I'll leave this slide up for just a moment or two in case you are jotting down some information. And just want to say thank you once again to our panelists and everyone in the audience for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you next time, and take care in the meantime.